we're here with Professor Albert Welter to talk about his first chapter in the readings of the Gateless Barrier, the Gong'an tradition in the Gateless Barrier as a special transmission outside the teachings. And I'm very happy to be here with Albert to talk about his great kind of introduction to the Wumangguan and many of the important issues that come up in it. Before we get into, maybe more particular questions, just as a way of maybe introducing your perspective on Chan literature and the Wumangguan in particular. Maybe you could just tell us a bit, how you got into this kind of line of work, for lack of a better word, as a historian of Chan
Mm,
and Buddhism, and the
yeah.
topic of your specialty, Zen and Chan in particular, of course, we're curious about. But what's your intellectual background and approach to these things? That's something maybe we could start with.
Well, thank you, Eric. And I want to start by saying it's a pleasure and an honor to be interviewed by a esteemed scholar like Eric. Really admire his work and encourage everyone who might be listening, watching, to take a look at his work as well. Now, in terms of how I got here, I mean, this is a question that one in from my background often gets asked. I came from a rural. I was born in a rural community in Oregon, and I was among the first generation of my family to go to university. So becoming a Buddhist scholar was not high on the list of conceivable occupations by myself or anyone else around me. In fact, I started university as a business major and a computer science minor, um, and but rather quickly became disenchanted with business courses and so on and so forth. It wasn't really my interest, so I ended up switching to political science, and which is I got my first degree in political science. But as part of that um, trajectory, at my university, we were required to take a course in a non-Western culture at that time. So I took a course on East Asian civilization. And that was my kind of eye-opening transitional experience because I didn't know much about East Asia beyond the sort of superficial, which you have to remember in those days, this was the 1970s. It's not like today where we have martial arts students, we have manga and anime, and you may contest, what kind of introduction that provides to students, but at least they come knowing something. I remember um, at my university, there was an interview. They interviewed a young Japanese American woman who was studying Japanese. And at the time, nobody studied Japanese. I mean, this was kind of like, there are probably many people studying Sanskrit as they were studying Japanese to give you some kind of an idea.
So
And
not very many.
not very many, yeah. So exactly. So well, and she said, there's not very many people here. I might as well be studying, I might as well be studying Mahayana Buddhism, she said. And so I took that in heart and I thought, well, gee, where does that leave me? I'm studying some combination of both at that time. Anyway, that awakened my interest in East Asia, and the next thing I knew, I was taking courses in Chinese history, studying Chinese language. At my university, there was a professor of Zen Buddhism, a Korean American by the name of Hee-Jin Kim, who wrote an early book on Dogen.
Dogen, mystical realist. I remember that one.
Yeah, exactly. So that was and if it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't have gone into the Chan Zen direction because my interests were multifold at that time, and could have, I could have ended up in many places in kind of Chinese thought, or for that matter, or even Western thought. I was still studying Western philosophy and so on and so forth. Anyway, long story short, I ended up at McMaster University studying in the East Asian Buddhism section back in the early days when East Asian Buddhism was just kind of carving out its role within Buddhist studies. And even at that time, McMaster program at that time was quite diverse. The religious studies program you had to take a minor in if you were in a Asian subject in a Western subject. So I was doing Western religious thought and was still quite interested in that, and toyed with the idea in my mind maybe I should go that route.
Mm,
But anyway, for whatever reason, well, because of my interest was sustained. I had a couple of professors there, Ron Yunhua and Koichi Shinohara, of course,
mm.
which your predecessor at Yale.
Yes.
And so through their encouragement, I ended up studying and continuing on in East Asian Buddhism. And I did study abroads at Komazawa University in Tokyo, Fudan University in Shanghai, and so on and so forth. So, um, you know, um, for someone who wanted to see the world, I thought Buddhist studies provided a tremendous avenue, to see the world in a very purposeful kind of way.
Mm,
But anyway, long story short, I think the main thing is that a lot of people in our business come through this through um, kind of a more maybe I could say a kind of a seeker background, religious seeker background, if I can put that, rather than maybe in a sort of just intellectual curiosity.
mm,
And so they spend time either in monasteries, either in the West or in Asia or someplace, and then they kind of filter through. A lot of people in our field do that. And I think that provides a wonderful kind of access that I sometimes feel like I lack that kind of
mm.
insider knowledge. But I was also encouraged. There are people like Timothy Barrett, for example, who provided a model. And of course, it was interesting to me because my professors at McMaster were, for lack of a better word, they were secularized Asians, right?
Mm.
Ron Yunhua, Koichi Shinohara, neither of them had any kind of affiliation, formal or informal, to my mind, with the Buddhist tradition. So they were, in a sense, they provided the kind of template, which I kind of naturally fell into as well.
Yeah, well, the contrast between the insider and outsider perspective, of course, is a perennial one in our field of religious studies. So, this outsider perspective may be a more historical perspective. This I very much see in your chapter here, which gives lots of
Yeah.
insight, of course, into these things. But since you mentioned Ran Yunhua, it's interesting because he has a sort of a little slim volume in Chinese on the kind of history of Chan or Zen, but as meditation rather than the sort of Chan tradition. And for me, in my own work on this was actually one of the earliest books that I read as a graduate student working on this. And so this leads me to the sort of second thing I was going to ask you, maybe just as a sort of, we'll have a range of people watching this podcast, I'm sure. And we have a book here, Readings in the Gateless Barrier on the Chan Zen tradition. And for many people, and when it's presented in the modern world, of course, Chan and Zen have a very close connection to the topic of meditation practice, which is something that draws lots of people to Buddhism. But I was thinking, as looking through the Gateless Barrier, the Gong'an, and your chapter, of course, but the whole text as in its entirety, I don't think the practice of Chan or Zen as meditation is mentioned there concretely even once. So I wonder what's how would you describe that connection? What exactly is the role that meditation plays in the Gong'an tradition at all? Is that something we need to be thinking about when approaching a text like this, or what's your
Well, I think, it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that Chan, which derives from, the Pali term supposedly somehow jhana or dhyana, for this kind of regimen of meditation that take traditional kind of meditation that leads you progressively to um, you know um, sort of away from the world and into kind of exploration of mental states that is more and more kind of remote from the actual world. I mean, the physical world. And in the Woman you get an idea of Chan, which is traditionally known the Chan master. Is somebody who excels in spontaneous action in the world. this kind of spontaneity. So that you get the idea of the Zen master as an action figure, which motif, which I think the Chan and Zen tradition has drawn from a lot. But I think, I mean, as you know, and I think as you agree, in actuality, this is kind of more, posturing, maybe rhetorical posturing that, because actually, um, um, the evidence seems to suggest that Chan practitioners did a lot of meditating, right? And in a very kind of traditional way, and they did very little of this suggestion here. And you have to remember that, even in the Womenguan, ostensibly these are um, Gong'an or koan that are given people to meditate on, right? To reflect on, so that the meditation context is presumed, I think, even though it's not, So it's an interesting dichotomy that I think the Chan tradition plays with, because on the one hand, they suggest that they are kind of, in some cases, radically opposed to these kind of traditional practices, but on the other hand, they're, might substantially embedded in them, right? At the same time. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing that we as scholars have been, playing with for quite a while. And
Definitely a foundational tension for Chan studies as an academic understanding of how these things happen in practice.
Mhm.
Funnily enough, this morning I asked ChatGPT in anticipation of this interview. I said, "What is Zen?" And it replied with two things. It said, "Zen is a Buddhist tradition in East Asia focused on meditation," and number two was koans. So that's kind of
Uh,
interesting that
yeah,
ChatGPT, in its sort of trawling of the internet, comes up with those two as the
yeah, yeah,
most
yeah, yeah,
distinctively Zen
yeah.
things. But I really like your term here, that the Chan master as an action figure, and I had a
Mhm.
flash in my mind of you could buy your little action figure Chan masters, but the idea of someone doing something. But this maybe is a good segue into the actual subject of your essay here on one of these Gongans and the action figure Chan master, who in this case, of course, is the Buddha. Maybe you could just tell us the story. You focus in your chapter both on the way that the Gong'an tradition as a whole embodies some of these sort of core tenets of Chan, let's just call it Chan ideology, the idea of the special transmission outside the teaching, but you then do it through the medium of this one particular Gong'an where this idea shows up. What is it, number six? Number
Number
six
six,
in
I
the
think.
Woman God.
Yeah.
What is the story of this Gong'an, this koan, and what did you find sort of interesting or noteworthy enough about it to really, I don't know if you chose to be the first chapter in the book, but you are now the first chapter in the book. So this really, sets the stage as this is somehow
Yeah.
the introduction. Um,
Yeah. Well, let me. I want to go back
yeah.
just for a moment, if I can, because this idea of the Chan Master as action figure, I think that oftentimes we contrast this with traditional Buddhism, but in some sense, I think this is somewhat unique way, maybe very uniquely Chinese way of trying depicting the Bodhisattva as exhibiting enlightenment while participating, or nirvana was participating in samsara. That this action figure isn't, is actually the fulfillment of, of the Mahayana Bodhisattva ideal, characterized, I think, in a very uniquely Chinese fashion. Now, the story itself is the so-called flower sermon, where the Buddha is on Vulture Peak, where he gave a lot of his Mahayana sutras, for example, the Lotus Sutra there. In this case, he comes before the assembly, the monks before him, and where he usually comes and he preaches. Instead of preaching this time, he allegedly he brings and he holds up a flower. And everybody in the assembly is perplexed except for Mahakashyapa, who smiles. And this is supposed to be the emblematic mind-to-mind transmission, the origin of the mind-to-mind transmission, the silent transmission that is done without words or teachings, but is kind of the meeting of the minds, so to speak. Um, you know, at the in the introduction, I'm trying to recall here, but what really kind of got me on this track was when I was reading the introduction, Woman Huikai's introduction to the Woman. He talks about um, being kind of like this silent state of supreme awakening, of kind of like being a deaf mute. He uses the analogy of that, and on the one hand, I thought, well, that's interesting, but it kind of perplexed me that this enlightened state was, kind of this, in some sense, regressive state of existence. Sort of this, the idea that you're the deaf mute, the person who is unable to speak is somehow um, um, the most advanced in terms of their understanding. So, and I wanted to try to find a way to tackle that perplexity for myself. So I found this story, because this is the origin story in a sense of the transmission, because the historical Buddha, you know, um, the foundation of the textual tradition comes, of course, through the historical Buddha and his alleged career as a teacher, coming through his disciple Ananda, who followed him around. And Ananda, after the Buddha passed away, Ananda allegedly had the tremendous memory and could recite all the teachings, and they were eventually written down. This is kind of like the standard way in which an abbreviated version of the standard way in which the textual tradition emerges. The So this is the kind of the alternate path of the mind-to-mind transmission that um, circumvents the need for this kind of textual transmission, um, and and sets up the problem of the relationship between mind-to-mind transmission and the textual tradition, because we have these two modes of transmission, which are how do they relate to each other? Is one superior than the other? Are they compatible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We have all of that. So that's what kind of interested me in this text, because I had done a lot of research the um, on a figure who believed in the textual transmission as a compatible with Chan, Yongming Yensho. So I was interested in kind of coming to grips with this alternate and in the Chan Zen tradition, more standard kind of interpretation of how enlightenment was understood and transmitted. And this was the foundation of the lineages and so on and so forth. And of course, the Chan and Zen masters down to the present day are allegedly part of this long chain going all the way back to this particular episode, right?
Yeah.
Because
So it really is foundational then to Chan in that
yeah,
sense. Well, one of your comments there points me to this other point that I think is really a main part of your chapter, as it were. But this interpretation, as you said, in the Chan tradition, in the Song dynasty, but also beyond, of this phrase, a separate, or as you have it in the translation of the case itself, right? A special transmission outside the teaching, which,
yeah,
as you demonstrate here, gets added to this sort of list of kind of four characteristics associated with Bodhidharma that goes
Yeah.
earlier to then become the sort of standard presentation of what Chan is. But as you said, there are some disagreements, I guess, is how maybe you
Mm.
would want to characterize it about what this idea means. So we have the words in the story, a special transmission outside the teaching. But one of the things you discuss in your chapter is the different ways that this was read by Chan figures and also non-Chan figures in the Song dynasty. And you chart the sort of divergence as one way of thinking about the development of kind of the official or eventually orthodox position here. Maybe you could just say quickly what are these two positions? I think maybe most of the listeners are familiar, or if more likely to be familiar with this eventually orthodox position that the Chan
Yeah.
transmission is entirely apart from the written teachings of the Buddha embodied in the scriptures that are the
Mm.
preserved other Buddhist schools. But there were other views of this even within Chan. What were those views, and what's what do you make of this sort of fighting about this, if that's the right word?
Well, in my chapter, uh, I was interested because, of course, I think many of us, perhaps all of us, when you're first introduced to Chan, you're introduced to the four slogans. And the first slogan is a special transmission outside the teaching, no dependence on word and letters, direct pointing to the human mind, see your nature and become a Buddha, right? Something like, along those lines. That's the translation. But the first one seems to be the crucial one, and that was the one that, in my investigation, I thought, well, not everybody agreed with that. A lot of people would recite the slogans, the latter three, but not the first one. Initially. And I came to understand that this slogan was really a late addition to the party, so to speak. And not only did it not originate back with the historical Buddha and Mahakashyapa, it did not originate with Bodhidharma. It had not originated through any of the early Chan patriarchs. It wasn't until the 11th century, when during the Song dynasty, when Chan was in a position to make claim for the centrality of its tradition within Chinese Buddhism, anyway, that this kind of pretext came into being, and ironically, I can't remember exactly. You have to go back and look in my chapter to get to, but eventually it actually gets put into a sutra.
Yes.
This saying, and so it's sort of like, which is extremely ironical in some sense.
Yes, this
Uh,
is the sutra. I think you translate the title here, right? The sutra where Brahman asks Buddha to resolve his doubts, the
right.
Dong'an
Okay.
Tenmo,
Yeah.
142.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah,
So.
this was another of my questions. This, and you just since you got to it, maybe I'll just push you towards that in particular, right? That this
Mm,
idea of the wordless teaching, or a
mm,
transmission outside the teachings, as it were, is fought over and then justified on the basis, at least in some cases, of finding it in a Buddhist sutra, which seems to have been kind of newly created
yeah.
in the Song dynasty. This, practice of the creation of new sutras attributed to the Buddha. This is a very long-standing thing that occurs throughout all of Buddhist history, both in India with Mahayana texts and in China with so-called apocryphal texts. This is a quite late one. I think this must be one of the
Mm.
later, in China at least, apocryphal sutras. But this is quite interesting, right? That you need a scripture to justify your claim that you have a transmission outside the scriptures. That's what's
Well, I mean, that's like I said, that's the irony of ironies, and that's the kind of um, dichotomies that we find within Chan, that it's uh, forever talking about not depending on words and letters, to being a special transmission outside the teachings, but in effect, let me step back a little bit, because originally this came through, as I recall, through kind of Chan texts and Chan, we would call them Yulu, or discourse record texts. And, that in itself, originally, the discourse records were conceived as the record of the the Chan masters' words and sayings and so on, which you know probably well in contradiction to what they were saying, these things were written down in notebooks and eventually compiled and published, right? So they became a, a kind of an alternate textual tradition in a sense, that a new textual tradition. And um,
And just to clarify for our listeners here who may not be as familiar with all these different genres, the Guan, that's the collection of Gong'ans or koans, which has stories of the sayings and doings of Chan masters, but of many different ones. And you're speaking now about the discourse records, which were kind of like collections of the sayings of
mhm,
individual
yeah,
teachers, which were maybe transmitted by their students. And it's from those larger collections that at a certain point in the second half, more or less, of the Song Dynasty, the Gong'an collections were created by extracting sort of individual choice bits, as it were.
exactly. Good. Yeah. So that there is a very close connection between these discourse records and the Gong'an or koan text. That's very much the case.
This question of the irony, I guess,
Yeah.
about uh, the creation
Oh.
of a textual tradition that could
Mhm.
justify the claim of something beyond the textual tradition. And I think you were saying, and among other things, that there was sort of a always a little bit of attention about this as these sayings and doings were collected into books and printed and distributed. And this, of course, brings us into the interesting historical questions about how this literature was created. And this is something that you and your other work, I know, have written quite a lot about, the formation of these collections of sayings, formations of the koan collections, and other things. And this brings us into this wider historical thing that, of course, if you are a practitioner of Chan, you're maybe not so worried about. But if you want to know where these things came from, this becomes a quite essential part of it.
I think, Eric, in my mind, the basic question is that, if you try to create a tradition that is completely free of any kind of conventional supports, and that's, doctrine, words, texts, rituals, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, where are you? You ultimately you don't have a tradition. I mean, you don't have anything. So and I think that this is probably, we can see this in the case of Chan, that in spite of its rhetorical flourishes, in reality, it has to be rooted in some kind of conventional Buddhist institutional framework. And in fact, that's the case. In a sense, we don't depend on sutras, but here's validation for it in a
Mm,
sutra. You
yeah,
know, I mean, that's kind of an extreme case of the dichotomy, but
right.
I think you get that a lot in the
Yeah.
Chinese. You can talk about, kind of wordless truth, but how do you convey it? Unless if you stay in your deaf mute condition,
Yeah.
that'll be the end of it.
Well, and this, of course, is, it's that paradox, if you want to use that word, is itself the subject of perhaps all Gong'an, even, or many anyway. And this, I wonder,
Mm,
you've in your chapter, in order to explicate the history of this idea of the separate transmission, you took the koan in question as a, jumping off point to look at the way that this idea enters Chan. But of course, there is the question of why is this episode a Gong'an, right? What's the sort of problem,
mm,
as it were, that needs to be answered. And that's clearly in here to some degree, right? We have the
yeah,
flower is the
yeah,
wordless thing. But then of
yeah.
course there's a word full explanation that follows. And this is sets up some of maybe the tension that the Gong'an itself is
Eric, I'd have to go back and look, but I remember, I think Woman's commentary in the actual Gong'an,
yeah.
something to the extent, well, um, what would have happened if Mahakashyapa hadn't smiled?
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Well,
what if,
yeah, this is I have it here, so I'll just read it because I
okay,
when I
okay,
teach
good.
this, this is often there's a number of very choice lines, right, where he
Yeah,
says,
yeah.
uh, The golden-faced Gautama behaved as if no one was capable. He turned the noble into the lowly, and this is my favorite line, and sold dog meat advertised as mutton.
Yeah, I love that one too.
If the whole assembly had smiled, how would the Buddha have passed on the treasury of the true Dharma?
Yeah, it's a
If
whole,
Mahakashapa had not smiled, how would the
right,
Buddha have transmitted it?
right, right. So, yeah, that's the so you have to appreciate the fact that this is the foundational moment in the tradition, and that's not exactly making fun of it, but certainly making light of it and asking some questions about, well, questioning somehow the position of its primacy,
Yeah,
right?
definitely,
That it's
definitely.
not, and that, of course, and that is very Chan, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. To shift gears just a little bit here and move to kind of maybe more historical type questions that again are uh, sort of the
Mm,
focus of much of your chapter here. One topic that I think comes up in a number of ways that might have been new to some readers. You discuss as a crucial when you're retracing this history and the development of these Chan ideas from the Tang into the Song dynasty. You spend some time mentioning the so-called Wuyue kingdom as a
mm.
kind of time and place when a number of crucial things happen in the history of Chan ideology and more broadly in the history of what scholars call the so-called Tang Song transition. Can you just say a few things about this? What is this Wuyue kingdom and why is it important, both for your particular story of the wordless transmission, but also Chan history more broadly?
Yeah, well, first of all, I came across Wu Yue by serendipity, really, because everybody that I studied, Yongming Yanshou, Zhan Ning, the Jingde Chuandong Lu, all of these things, and so on. All of a sudden, I realized they're all coming out of Wu Yue. And I thought, what's going on here? So this is what kind of prompted my fascination with Wu Yue. And you know, sort of thinking about it in broader terms, that Wu Yue's, of course, it's Wu Yue is a kingdom within the so-called five dynasties and 10 kingdoms period of Chinese history. That's the 10th century, between the Tang and the Song, as you mentioned. And first of all, at least when I began studying, nobody talked about the five dynasties in the 10 kingdoms period. Everybody talked about the Tang Dynasty Buddhism, and Song Dynasty Buddhism. And all of a sudden, through this studying of figures that came out of Wu Yue, I realized this kind of sort of time in between was really quite crucial, and especially in terms of the Buddha story. And I think, obviously, when you get into the Song Dynasty, the way that the intellectual history, Chinese intellectual history, has been written really favors the rise of Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism. And so oftentimes you see books like, on Chinese history, the Song Dynasty, the age of Neo-Confucianism, and so on and so forth. And I mean, I'm not, well, I'm not so much questioning it completely, but I'm revising it because this is a retroactively told story too. That the so-called Neo-Confucian winners, particularly the Jushi faction. And remember, Jushi didn't live until the end of the Song Dynasty. Jushi orthodoxy was not advocated in the Song Dynasty. It started in the Yuan dynasty, particularly in the Ming dynasty. So these people in the Yuan and then in the Ming who rewrote the history of the Song, went back and they traced their lineage and they made it sound like it was the only trunk in the tree, basically. And actually, if you go back, it's a lot more complicated story. And that made me kind of think about, we talk about Neo-Confucianism, but in some ways you can talk about the Song Dynasty as a Neo-Buddhism, right? That Buddhism is kind of being revived and reinterpreted and so on. And Wu Yue is kind of a very key linchpin in that reinterpreted process. Because what happens in Wu Yue becomes the kind of template, not only for much of China, but also through East Asia, through Korea and Japan. Wu Yue is a trading network at that time. The Korean monks come to Wu Yue particularly to study Buddhism, Chan Buddhism there at that time. Later on, the Wu Yue region, the greater region during the Song Dynasty, is going to be the base from which Zen gets transmitted to Japan. So it becomes extremely, and it had an importance, of course, before this period, because Mount Tiantai is there, so Tiantai Buddhism is centered there. So it was spiritually significant for a long time. But I think with Wu Yue, when Wu Yue came into being, it kind of went up a notch. And you have to remember that this was the so-called Five Dynasties period, which in some ways it's the conventions of Chinese history require that there's always an emperor, right, in place. The Five Dynasties is, they're just a series of warlords that come in. You got five dynasties in 60 years. I mean, that's 12 years per dynasty on average. So you've got a chance for one person to come in, maybe the second one start and they get overthrown. So it's really a kind of a period of immense change, political change, and social disruption, and very important military conflict. And because of that military conflict, a lot of Buddhists retreated to Wu Yue. Wu Yue was kind of like a safe haven, a safe enclave. And it was buffered by another one of the 10 kingdoms, the Southern Tang, which was also a powerful kingdom. And the importance for Wu Yue, but as long as the Southern Tang was there, Southern Tang fought most of the battles, and it's kind of surrounded the Wu Yue kingdom. And Wu Yue was a haven of peace and prosperity, so they could do international trade. They could do all of these kinds of things, and they could develop themselves as a Buddhist kingdom, which they did. This became the kind of template. So yeah, it's and of course Chan is kind of central to that story of the Buddhist revival in Wu Yue. But it's a kind of a Wu Yue definition of Chan, which is not the at this point not the kind of the Linji Chan, but it belongs with another faction, so-called later on as one of the five factions, the Fa Yin faction,
Mm.
and which is much more, um, I would say, much more conventional. It's not so radical, doesn't represent that wing of Chan. So, and that was coming into the early Song Dynasty, that was the dominant form of Chan initially, very initially. And shortly thereafter, the Linji faction became prominent.
The story that I had when I first studied these things in a kind of academic context, it was under the tutelage of Griff Folk, who
Yeah,
was sort of an early great scholar of Chan. And the thing that he always highlighted for us, I recall, is this distinction between what is sometimes called the kind of golden age of Chan in the late Tang dynasty. So this is in
right.
basically 800s and early 900s versus the Song dynasty, which is when the Womanguan
Mm.
is made, which in a certain mode of history telling was a time when the action was no longer taking place, right? The stories in the koans are all about these earlier figures. And then, of course, in some cases, like the story of Mahakashapa, this is all the way back to the Buddha, but most of the figures in the Womanguan are these sort of late Tang dynasty figures. So we have this kind of disconnect between the period in which the literature is kind of created versus the time when it was supposedly really happening. And what Folk always emphasized was that it's really in the song when these things are being put together. So is from that perspective, is the significance of Wu Yue seems like from what you're saying, as the moment when this sort of Tang tradition is what codified, crystallized, brought together. I mean, do we really know anything about what's going on in the actual times and place of some of these great Chan masters, or do you think this is all the stories that we get in texts like the Woman Guan? Are these put together in? Obviously, the Woman Guan is later than we will understand.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
in your telling, this is when some of these key features that become associated with Chan Orthodoxy, we see them for the first time. That's the history you're telling in part is the creation of this idea. So do you agree with this idea that that we need to think of Chan, despite the protagonists often being, from an earlier
Mhm.
generation, the Golden Age, that Wu Yue is really this creative moment when it's kind of being put together. As you said, people are coming together to escape conflict and war, and they have a kind of Buddhist kingdom. Is that
Mhm.
that's a story? I like that idea, but I'm not sure whether historically you fully. Uh, what do you think about that?
No, I agree with it almost completely. I would actually push it forward a little bit. I mean, Wu Yue is a kind of inspiration, but it really doesn't get codified until the early Song Dynasty. Because when what happens, Buddhism in Wu Yue is very strong and very important, but it's still a regional movement. In the Song Dynasty emperors start to validate Chan, right? That's huge. I mean, the Jing de Chuandong Lu, for example, the text about the transmission of the lamp, has a preface by the emperor,
Hmm.
and is put into the canon, right? So these kinds of things are things that have never happened, rarely happened for Buddhism in China, but it never happened for Chan. All of a
Hmm.
sudden, Chan has taken center stage in a big, 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 profound way. And so, of course, oh wow, our tradition is, we're you know, we're the focal point of Buddhism at this point. So, we need to go back and we need to um, record everything we can about our founding figures. And of course, particularly the Linji faction wins out in this because they kind of eclipse the Fayan faction at the Song Dynasty court, and they get to kind of begin to tell their story about their heroes and so on and so forth. But aside from there are some tomb inscriptions that are that we can date back earlier than kind of the five dynasties and Song Dynasty period. You know, almost all of this material comes out of the Song Dynasty, and and especially the how can I say that we might say the can I use the word heroization, turning these people into heroes, turning them into action figures, this kind of amplifying who they were, their characters and their personalities and their personas. That seems to me to be very much a Song Dynasty
Hmm.
innovation, that these are people that are creating their tradition and they're creating their heroes. And they're creating them in such a way that are of interest not only just to they themselves as practitioners, but to wider society. And on top of it, they've got printing all of a sudden. They've got, you can actually print up these texts. You don't no longer have to hand copy them, but you can disseminate them widely. So they're widely and easily available to,
You're talking about the discourse records of the Chan masters in the Song Dynasty, now
correct. That's
making use
correct.
of this sort of relatively new technology at the time of printing.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right. So, yeah. So this is the golden age of the Chan of Zen is, by and large, it's a retrospective view from the Song Dynasty that are creating their tradition at the moment where they've assumed a position of a status of importance among the literati at the Song Dynasty court.
Your mention of the literati reminds me of something else I was going to ask you. You've mentioned already this very important sort of I guess you could call it a predecessor to the Gong'an collections like the Guan, and this is this text, the Jingde Chuanlonglu, the
Yeah.
transmission of the lamp, compiled in the Jingde era, which, for those listeners who don't know, is not necessarily the first, but the most famous early example of this genre, compiling together the stories that of the Chan masters and putting them into a kind of lineage, and it spawned various further instantiations of this genre later. But this Jingde Chuanlonglu, the transmission of the lamp of the Jingde era, this is the one that you mentioned a moment ago, has the preface by the emperor, and this is the one where I believe in your attempts to sort of reconstruct the history of the special transmission outside the teaching. This is the document in which we really see this now held up as kind of Chan orthodoxy. One of
Mhm.
the points that comes up in your discussion of this in your chapter, which some readers may have glossed over, is that it is compiled and put together by a layperson, this figure, Yang Yi. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about the significance of this, because I think from a historical perspective, and also something that is perhaps not as familiar to many
Mhm.
people who are interested in Chan, the involvement of, on the one hand, the emperor, as you already mentioned, endorsing it, but not just endorsing it, the actual creation of these compendiums of the sayings
Mhm.
and doings of the Chan masters, this
Mhm.
creation of this, you called it the heroization, but this retrospective imagination and creation and curating of the literary legacy of the Tang dynasty and the sayings and doings, that this is put together by a layperson. This seems very significant to me, especially in terms of your comments about, say, these technological changes like printing, spreading these books of sayings and doings of Chan masters to a wider audience. What is the role, more broadly, maybe even, of the literati, the non-monastic sort of elite literate class of China in the creation and maintenance and development of what we call Chan Buddhism?
Well, this is a really good question, Eric. And I think in short is the role of Yang Yi is paramount. And you know, first of all, just for clarification, Yang Yi wasn't the actual compiler of the Jingde Chuandong The compiler was a monk by the name of Dao Yuan, who also from Wu Yue,
Oh,
also from Wu Yue. It came out of Wu Yue. And unfortunately, we have very, very little information, almost no information on Dao Yuan. But what we do know is that Yang Yi was the editor and had editorial board. And um, the version that we have has his imprint upon it. We don't have Dao Yuan's original version, but we have, interestingly, Yang Yi wrote two prefaces, one to Dao Yuan's original version, and then to the ultimate version, the Jingde Chuandong Lu. The original version had a title, if I can recall off the top of my head, um, the combined practice of the Buddhas and the patriarchs, the common practice of the Buddhas and the patriarchs, which, and then if you go on and you read the preface, it kind of follows, and at least in the way I argue, it follows a more Fa Yin interpretation of Chan, which is more compatible. It sees the Chan tradition as important, but very much compatible with the Buddhist tradition at large, and doesn't see it as a kind of independent or anything like this. In the second preface, and this is the most important one because this is the preface that is attached to the text, the Jingde Chuandong Lu, you know, Yang Yi describes it as a special practice outside the teaching, not a special transmission, but a special practice. But of course, this would later be turned into a special transmission. So the origin of this, the idea of Chan as a special practice or a special transmission outside the teaching, is something that is codified by Yang Yi,
mm,
by a layperson. So the question is, why would he do it? What was interesting? First of all, Yang Yi was no ordinary layperson. He was very much a practitioner under Linji Chan masters at the Song Dynasty court. And in fact, in the subsequent transmission record, the Guangdong Lu, Yang Yi has a biography. He's in the lineage. So he's not just a layperson there. He's a layperson, but he's a master. He's recognized as a master. And actually, the second one, the Guangdong Lu, the expanded transmission record, it's also compiled by a layperson. So this, in the early Song dynasty, the lay people at the court were heavily involved in promoting Linji Chan Buddhism. And then you can ask the further question, why were they involved? Well, Yang Yi was one of the preeminent literati figures of his day. And he was involved, the Song dynasty was putting the tradition back together again after a hiatus of, well, really over 60 years, because it goes well back into the Tang dynasty. There was a lot of fracturing that happened in the later half of the Tang dynasty, and it held together by a thread, during its later years. So for over 100 years or so, things had kind of fallen apart. So when the Song Dynasty put it back together again, obviously, I mean, one of the first questions that they did, well, they did two things. One thing, they promoted one culture over Wu military. And this was kind of a signal. It's always interesting in Chinese history when these military warlords assume power. Most of them continue their militarization programs. But in the Song Dynasty's case, they said, oh, it's time to change the channel. We're going to promote culture. But the question is, what was culture? What was the meaning of this one? And so Yang Yi and other literati at the Song court, they came up with an idea of culture, which literary culture, which embraced spontaneous free expression. So that what they saw in Linji Chan and Linji Chan literature epitomized their vision and of what the Song Dynasty culture could be. And it had its moment in the early Song Dynasty where it had kind of a lot of support, I would say. Eventually, it was eclipsed. But this is how Yang Yi kind of fits into the picture, and really the kind of as I call it, the ascendancy of Chan Buddhism is very much as a result of literati figures, especially someone like Yang Yi, who had such prominence and played such a role in kind of developing the idea of Chan in the early Song Dynasty.
Do you think this other, so you mentioned here that the this idea of Chinese culture connected to a sort of, free expression, as it were, that this was something which prompted some of these literati figures to look to Chan as a kind of Buddhism, I guess, that they could support. One of the stories that I've always heard, well, has sort of floats around, I guess, of course, thinking about Chan in connection to Chinese culture more broadly is typically, very often at least, said to be Chan, the kind of form of Buddhism in China that in various ways becomes most, I'm always a little wary of overly simplistically describing it this way, but becomes most attuned to Chinese culture in some way, the most Chinese form of Buddhism. These are comments about Chan that one often hears. One place where this, I think, is often discussed and is directly relevant to a text like the Gong'an, is at the matter of sort of expression. When we read the Gong'ans and we look at woman's comments and the verses that follow, right, we have some attempt, it seems, right, to express Buddhist ideas using a kind of, maybe let's call it poetic register of Chinese, right? We have allusions to classical Chinese figures that somehow the sort of Buddhist doctrine that was maybe more known through sort of sutras, which have a kind of particular Indian kind of literary quality to them, now appear in the mouths and speech of these Chinese Chan masters who are speaking kind of poetry, right? They're doing a version of the sort of maybe poetry contests. This, of course, goes back to the Platform Sutra, but the poetry contest that literati culture was known for. So that's one element. Do you think that this idea of the special transmission, just to sort of conclude here, because we only have another few minutes, this idea of the special transmission outside the teachings, is there some reason that this was an idea of particular attraction to lay Buddhists in China, do you think, that would have made someone like Yang Yi gravitate towards this as a defining feature of things?
Well, you know, that's a big question, and maybe
We only have a few minutes, so don't
yeah,
worry,
I
you
was
don't
gonna
have
say
to answer it completely.
I know I need more time to think about it, but I know I don't have more time to think about it. But I think the special transmission outside the teaching motif, it had a way of um, cleverly kind of sweeping aside and looking at things afresh. All of a sudden we can look at them. We don't have to take all of that other stuff so seriously. We don't have to go through the exegetical commentaries and so on and so forth. We can cut through and be much more direct. And I think this had an appeal. Remember, in the Song Dynasty, we have, you know, a new class is actually emerging, a broader class. We don't have we no longer have the old aristocracy in power, but we have new players and a bunch of new players. With the rise of printing, we get expanded literacy. We get a lot. We get new kinds of art forms, new kinds of dramas, and so on and so forth. These things are bubbling up. We have the rise of really merchant culture, if you will. In defiance of what Confucians like to say, the merchants kind of held a lot of power and had a lot of sway because they had the power of the purse. And of course, a lot of them were interested um, in ideas. And I think, Chan with this, with the Yulu, the dialogue records, is a way, it presents a story which a lot of people, literati, who wouldn't necessarily be interested in traditional Buddhism, it gives them a way to access it that's maybe not so serious or as serious as you'd like to. I hesitate to equate them with the so-called nightstand Buddhists of our present day.
Mm.
But I think there's maybe a little bit
Yeah.
of that kind of thing going on in the early Song dynasty.
Well, just as you said, a way in which an accumulated textual tradition, which requires an enormous amount of study just to even be able to understand. And if you've ever tried to read, mid-Tang Dynasty sutra commentaries, which I can tell you that it's a whole world that you have to be initiated into. So
Yeah,
certainly the idea that there is some way to directly access the Buddhist teachings without that, I don't think we need to be. It doesn't need to be. It's not a dismissive comment to
yeah,
say that this
yeah,
is something which
yeah.
broadens
And
the appeal
and
of
it can
Buddhism.
and it can be somewhat entertaining at the same time.
Entertain, yes. And of course, then, just to sort of conclude on a point of irony, which befits our study of Chan,
Yeah,
as the Gong'an collections reveal, Chan itself develops its own textual world that
yeah,
begins to
yeah,
require the kind of
yeah,
immersive study that maybe it initially
yeah.
said was not necessary. Well, I think that's a very nice place to kind of bring us to an end here. So I'll just give my thanks to Albert for his wonderful chapter, sort of introducing the Woman Guan, bringing us really this historical perspective. And
Yeah.
you kind of really got into it there at the end of your comments in terms of situating Chan intellectually within the historical context of early Song China, which is, of course, very different from maybe a perspective that would see Chan only in terms of its particular expression of sort of Buddhist ideas and not thinking about that context. But these two perspectives together are ones that certainly historians of religion like ourselves like to always have both of them available for our explanations. So thank you again to Albert for his chapter and this conversation, which I hope everyone enjoys. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Maybe I hope someday that I will have a chance to interview you on your wonderful
Ah,
work.
yes, I'm sure we'll have to arrange that.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Albert.
Yeah. Bye-bye.